Welcome to 8 Digital Podcast, where we break down the world's most pressing conflicts and power struggles. Today, we dive into a story that could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East, the future of Iran's nuclear program following unprecedented military strikes by the United States and Israel. On June 13th, 2025, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, targeting Iran's key nuclear sites at Natanz, Fordo, and Esfahan. Just days later, the U.S. followed with its own wave of strikes under Operation Midnight Hammer. The official rhetoric has been triumphant. Former President Trump spoke of total obliteration, but on-the-ground assessments remain murky. U.S. intelligence estimates the damage may only delay Iran's program by months, while Israeli and IAEA officials suggest the impact could last for years. But here's where things get more dangerous. Iran has responded not by retreating, but by doubling down. Supreme Leader Khamenei vowed the program would continue. Parliament voted to suspend cooperation with the IAEA. And there's growing domestic pressure in Iran to develop a nuclear bomb, not just a civilian program. Tehran has even threatened to quit the Non-Proliferation Treaty altogether, a move that could set off a regional chain reaction with states like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So where does this all lead? Is diplomacy still on the table, or are we heading toward an irreversible nuclear crisis? Let's unpack the stakes, the strategy, and the shifting red lines. All right, let's pull back the curtain on this high-stakes drama that really shook the Middle East. Everything kicked off, was it June 13th, 2025? Israel's Operation Rising Lion. Right.
Think of it as this, well, meticulously planned, almost surgical strike. But it wasn't a solo act for long.
No, not at all.
Just a few days later, the U.S. jumped into the fray with Operation Midnight Hammer. So we're talking about a significant, coordinated military punch aimed squarely at Iran's nuclear infrastructure. And almost immediately, you heard this triumphant rhetoric coming out of Washington, especially from former President Trump, phrases like total obliteration.
Yeah, that was the language used.
Suggesting Iran's nuclear ambitions had just been completely wiped off the map.
And that's where the plot thickens, wouldn't you say? Because while those declarations were certainly bold, the reality on the ground, well, it quickly became much, much murkier. We saw these immediate and frankly conflicting assessments.
Right.
Early U.S. intelligence, specifically from the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, they were much more cautious. They were hinting the damage might only delay Iran's program by a few months.
Just months after all that. Exactly. But then almost simultaneously, you had officials from Israel and the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the global nuclear watchdog, suggesting the impact could actually last for years.
Yeah.
This immediate divergence, it isn't just about different timelines. It reveals this crucial tension in how the world was seeing and talking about what actually happened and what it really meant.
That difference is really fascinating, isn't it? It's like everyone's watching the same movie, but coming away with completely different ideas about the ending.
Yeah.
And here's the major plot twist, maybe the biggest one. Instead of these strikes forcing Iran to retreat or, dial back their nuclear ambitions.
They seem to have had the exact opposite effect.
Exactly. Iran has effectively doubled down. We're not seeing de-escalation. We're seeing defiance, a real hardening of their stance. It just sets the stage for this precarious situation we're in right now, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. This defiant response, it directly challenges that underlying assumption, the idea that military force would simply compel Iran to change its strategic thinking. Instead, it looks like it reinforced their resolve, maybe pushed them closer to decisions that could fundamentally reshape the whole non-proliferation landscape, not just for Iran, but for the entire region. It's a classic case of unintended consequences playing out on a huge geopolitical scale.
So if the buzz was total obliteration, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What did these operations, Rising Lion and Midnight Hammer, actually hit? First up, Natanz, the Natanz nuclear complex.
Right, the big one.
This place is basically Iran's crown jewel for uranium enrichment. It's hugely significant, housing thousands, literally thousands of centrifuges, those machines that spin super fast to enrich uranium deep underground, plus others on the surface for R&D and for producing that highly enriched uranium, the 60% stuff.
And the initial Israeli strikes on June 13th, they zeroed in on what's called the Pilot Fuel Enrichment Plant, the PFEP, and crucially, its electrical infrastructure.
Cut the power.
Cut the power. The idea was to cripple the centrifuges in the main underground hall, starve them of electricity.
And did it work? What did we see afterwards?
Well, the very next day, satellite imagery seemed to confirm the strategy. You could see several, maybe two or three, small craters on the surface right above those underground halls. And these weren't your typical big blast craters. They looked like they were caused by penetrators.
Bombs designed to go through first.
Exactly. Designed to bore through rock, concrete, whatever, before detonating. So that suggested pretty significant damage below ground. Even the IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi, he noted the main Cascade Hall seemed seriously damaged, and he mentioned a possibility of uranium isotopes maybe disposing inside the facility, though thankfully no public danger.
But the U.S. wasn't leaving it at that, were they?
No, definitely not. On June 22nd, they followed up with their own strikes, and we're talking the big guns here. At least one GBU-57 bunker buster penetration hole was seen right over that buried enrichment hall. The U.S. Department of Defense even reported using at least two of these massive bombs, maybe even double tapping, hitting the same spot twice for maximum effect.
So the assessment after that?
The assessment is that the Natanz site is now, quote, likely destroyed and knocked out of operation. That's about as definitive as you get when you're talking about hitting something buried that deep.
Okay, so Natanz took a massive hit. What about Fordo? The Fordo enrichment plant. That one's notorious for being even deeper, even harder to reach, right?
Absolutely. Fordo is an even more deeply buried site, originally built in secret. It was part of the old Ahmad plan, Iran's former covert nuclear weapons program. Western intelligence found it back in 2009.
And Iran claimed it was civilian after that.
Yeah, they declared it for civil use. But early inspections actually found internal pipework that looked consistent with producing weapon-grade uranium. That pipework was later removed, but, the suspicion remained. And its defenses are legendary. It was designed specifically to withstand even the most powerful conventional attacks, built into a mountain, basically.
So how do you even try to hit something like that, something designed to be virtually unhittable?
Well, the U.S. certainly gave it their best shot on June 22nd. They unleashed a barrage, 12 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, those same bunker busters, directly over the enrichment halls.
12.
12. And the high-resolution satellite imagery is pretty clear. It showed two distinct clusters of 3 penetration holes each, right above the ventilation shafts and the service structures. Very precise targeting.
And the verdict on Fordo?
The consensus is that the Fordo facility is likely severely damaged or destroyed. The bombing seems to have been precisely aimed for maximum impact on those crucial centrifuge halls buried deep inside.
But there was something strange going on there just before the strikes, wasn't there? With trucks and tunnels?
Ah, yes, and here's where things get really intriguing. Reports came out on June 21st, just a day before that big U.S. attack, saying Iranians were actively backfilling tunnel entrances with soil.
Why would they do that? Defense?
Could be a defensive measure, maybe to inhibit the attack, or maybe to try and contain the explosions if it was hit. But then satellite imagery also showed this convoy of trucks near Fordo's tunnel entrances, and that sparked a lot of debate.
What kind of debate?
Were they moving enriched uranium or maybe centrifuges out of the facility because they knew an attack was coming? Or alternatively, were they bringing sensitive items in for protection, maybe believing Fordo was the safest place to hide things?
That's a massive unknown, isn't it? Whether the most valuable stuff was even still in there when the bombs hit?
It's a crucial unknown. It really complicates the assessment of the true impact. It's a real head-scratcher, like something out of a spy novel unfolding in real time.
And then just to add another layer, Israel reportedly hit Fordo again.
Reportedly, yes. On the night of June 22nd, going into the 23rd. This time, supposedly targeting the access routes, maybe to obstruct any movement in or out of the site after the main strikes. It just highlights the intensity, the multi-layered nature of these operations.
Okay, so Natanz and Fordo, the enrichment giants, were hammered. What else was on the list? The Esfahan nuclear complex. That's a big one too, right? Different function, though.
Very different, yes. Esfahan is this sprawling complex. It includes the uranium conversion facility, the UCF, and various facilities for uranium conversion, fuel fabrication, even uranium metal production. Think of it as a crucial chemical processing hub. It takes raw uranium and converts it into the gas, uranium hexafluoride, that feeds the centrifuges for enrichment.
And Esfahan took a beating as well.
Oh, yeah. Esfahan really got hit hard, kind of a triple whammy. The first Israeli attack, June 14th, damaged 4 buildings. Now, what's critical here is that the enriched uranium metal conversion plant was apparently destroyed.
Why is that one so important?
Because that plant is a potential bottleneck. It's a crucial step in turning enriched uranium gas into a metallic form, which is what you'd likely need for the core of a nuclear weapon. So hitting that was significant. Also, the Tehran reactor fuel manufacturing plant, which was known to store both 20% and 60% highly enriched uranium, so partially damaged. And a possible shipping and receiving building and a central chemical laboratory were hit too.
So they went after the metal plant and places holding actual enriched material, but they weren't finished with Esfahan.
Not even close. A second Israeli attack hit on the night of June 20th, going into the 21st. This time, 6 more buildings were struck. These included facilities for natural and depleted uranium metal production, fuel rod production, low-enriched uranium pellet production, labs, workshops.
A real sweep.
A real sweep. Now, the IAEA, in its assessment, noted that these specific buildings contained no nuclear material or small quantities, which was fortunate, as it limited the potential contamination just to the damaged structures themselves.
And then the U.S. weighed in on Esfahan, too.
Yes. The U.S. took its turn on June 22nd. They used Tomahawk cruise missiles, which severely damaged the main uranium conversion facility, that absolutely crucial UCF building needed for producing the hexafluoride gas for the centrifuges.
So hitting it at the source before enrichment even starts.
Exactly.
Right.
And here's another detail pointing to Iran's attempted evasive maneuvers. All 4 tunnel entrances to an underground complex just north of the main Esfahan site collapsed. And why? Because, just like at Fordo, the Iranians had actively backfilled them, likely trying to block access or contain explosions. It's this constant cat-and-mouse game.
It sounds like these strikes were incredibly comprehensive, going way beyond just the big famous sites like Natanz and Fordo. They also zeroed in on the places making the parts and the places linked to actual weapon design, right?
Absolutely. They clearly targeted Iran's centrifuge manufacturing capabilities and sites linked to potential nuclear weaponization. For instance, the Davatesa Karaj centrifuge manufacturing site, this was a vital hub for producing centrifuge components. Well, it was nearly completely destroyed by airstrikes on June 17th. Its 2 large manufacturing buildings were just demolished.
And they knew Iran had moved stuff from Karaj before.
They did. Some equipment from Karaj had actually been moved to another centrifuge manufacturing site at Esfahan back in 2022, probably after previous sabotage attacks. So guess what? That Esfahan building was also attacked on the night of June 20th, 21st.
You were really trying to dismantle the whole supply chain.
It certainly looks that way. Beyond manufacturing, they hit the Leviathan 2 campus, also known as the Mojda site. This place was seen as a kind of follow-on to the old Ahmad plan, Iran's former secret weapons program, and it was the initial headquarters of SPND, Iran's Organization of Defensive Innovation and Research. Think of it as the R&D hub for defense tech, including potentially sensitive nuclear-related work.
And SPND was hit hard.
Israeli strikes on June 16th destroyed or damaged several buildings there. That included the security building and also the Shahid Karimi Group facility, which has documented links to missile and explosives projects. This really highlights the focus wasn't just on enrichment, but on the actual weaponization efforts.
So they really went after the brains and the manufacturing muscle, didn't they? Even the new SPND headquarters, where they'd moved in 2013.
That was targeted too, hit by Israel on June 15th and then again on June 20th. Satellite imagery from June 18th between the strikes showed the building was still standing, but there was suspected internal damage, and you could see trucks actively removing materials.
Trying to salvage what they could, maybe.
Possibly. And in a rather somber, perhaps defiant gesture, the street itself was notably renamed Fakhrizadeh Street, after Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the nuclear scientist assassinated back in 2020.
Wow. And what about Sanjarian? That name came up in relation to the Ahmad plan, too.
Yes, Sanjarian. This was a critical Ahmad testing and manufacturing facility. It was infamous for developing what's called the shockwave generator. Now, to simplify, this is a multi-point initiation system, basically, the very precise trigger mechanism needed to set off a nuclear weapon.
So directly related to building a bomb.
Directly related. Sanjarian was attacked twice by Israel and showed extensive damage by June 20th. Several buildings were destroyed, including one that specifically housed those crucial shockwave generator development chambers. Again, this points to a very precise, deliberate effort to dismantle the actual weaponization pathway, not just the fuel production side.
And finally, what about the other route to a bomb? Plutonium. Was the Iraq reactor targeted?
It was. The IR-40 Iraq heavy water reactor and its associated heavy water production plant were also significant targets. Now, this reactor was originally designed to produce a substantial amount of weapon-grade plutonium. Under the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, its core design was modified to drastically reduce plutonium output, and the original core, the calandria, was reportedly filled with concrete.
But there were concerns they could reverse that.
Exactly. A major red flag went up when Iran reportedly imported a second set of tubes for the IR-40 reactor. This immediately raised concerns about their potential ability to reconstitute a plutonium path to a nuclear weapon, basically undoing the JCPOA modifications.
So what happened to Iraq in the strikes?
On June 19th, the containment dome of the IR-40 reactor was breached. Reports suggest a large internal explosion, likely rendering the reactor inoperable. And the final, third stage of the nearby heavy water production plant was also severely damaged. So this effectively looks like it eliminates Iran's major potential pathway for producing weapon-grade plutonium, at least for the foreseeable future. It was a critical hit, closing off an alternative road to the bomb.
Okay, so we've just gone through this incredibly detailed list of what was hit. Natanz, Fordo, Esfahan, manufacturing sites, weaponization research, the plutonium route. It sounds devastating, but now the real million-dollar question, the one everyone's asking.
Yeah.
What was the actual damage? Was it permanent destruction or just a temporary delay? Because the narratives here are, frankly, all over the map.
They really are.
You had those official White House claims. Total obliteration, sites obliterated, very strong language.
Very strong. And the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, he echoed that. His initial assessments pointed to extremely severe damage and destruction at Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. Sounds pretty definitive.
But then you get the UN nuclear chief, Rafael Grossi, from the IAEA. He acknowledged enormous damage, but he specifically cautioned that, quote, destroyed is too much.
Right. That's a crucial distinction.
He said he expected very significant damage, especially to those vibration-sensitive centrifuges, but not total annihilation. That difference between destroyed and severely damaged, it's huge, isn't it? It hints at the complex reality, especially for those underground facilities.
It does. And then, almost immediately, you had the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, coming out with a preliminary assessment suggesting only moderate to severe damage, and potentially setting back Iran's program by only months.
Months? That's a world away from total obliteration, or even years.
Exactly. And perhaps even more tellingly, the DIA report apparently stated they had low confidence in those early findings. That's a stark contrast, leaves you wondering what anyone really knew for sure in those first few days.
It really does. It highlights just how hard it must be to assess damage to these deeply buried, fortified sites so quickly. And the intelligence community itself seemed split, didn't it?
It seemed that way. You had CIA Director John Ratcliffe stating that several key Iranian nuclear facilities were destroyed and would have to be rebuilt over the course of years. So back to the years assessment. And Israel's Atomic Energy Commission chimed in with a similar take, declaring facilities totally inoperable and setting back Iran for many years to come.
So months versus years, damaged versus destroyed. This conflicting information isn't just semantics, is it? It tells us something profound about the challenges of these kinds of precision strikes, and maybe the information warfare that always surrounds them. Who do you believe, and what does that mean for what happens next?
That's the core of it. It brings us to this fundamental debate, one that goes way beyond just counting damaged buildings. Military action, yes, it can smash equipment, it can flatten facilities, but it simply cannot eliminate knowledge. It can't account for materials that might have been squirreled away beforehand. And crucially, it doesn't extinguish the underlying strategic drive for developing nuclear weapons.
It's like cutting down a tree versus trying to pull up every single root.
Right.
You can chop it down, but if the roots are still there...
It might just grow back. And this leads us straight to the relocation factor, which is maybe the biggest unknown in this whole equation. Remember, IAEA inspectors had actually verified Iran's nuclear material inventories just days before those first Israeli strikes on June 13th.
That timing is really suspicious.
Extremely. It immediately raised this tantalizing and worrying possibility that Iranian authorities preemptively relocated key stocks of highly enriched uranium from declared facilities to undisclosed locations. It's this huge lingering question mark hanging over everything.
And we even saw those satellite images from June 19th and 20th at Fordo showing dump trucks and bulldozers near the tunnel entrances.
Right, and they could have been interpreted in a couple of ways. Either they were sealing tunnels before the attack, maybe to contain explosions or block access, or, much more intriguingly, they were actively relocating materials out of the site.
And Iranian officials themselves actually claimed they moved enriched uranium.
They did go on record claiming that. But then former President Trump directly countered that, saying, quote, "We think everything nuclear is down there. They didn't take it out. So you have the top figures involved directly disagreeing on this critical point. It just speaks volumes about the fog of war, the challenges of intelligence gathering in real time.
So, even with all the visible damage, Iran might still have the key ingredient, the enriched uranium hidden somewhere else.
That's the concern. Despite the very real damage, there's a strong consensus among analysts that Iran's nuclear infrastructure retains substantial reconstitution potential. This isn't just about patching things up. Consider their existing stockpile of 60% highly enriched uranium, that near-bomb-grade stuff. If that material was successfully relocated, it keeps its proliferation potential regardless of how much infrastructure got smashed.
How much are we talking about? Enough for weapons?
Before these strikes, estimates suggested Iran had enough of this 60% HEU that, if converted, could fuel several nuclear weapons. Now, the primary rapid pathway for conversion, maybe through Natanz or Fordow, might have been eliminated or severely damaged, but that could simply force them to rely on smaller, less efficient, or even covert facilities to do the final steps. It's a setback, maybe a significant one, but not necessarily a full stop if they have the material.
And it's not just the enriched uranium itself, is it? They've been building centrifuges for years.
Exactly. Iran has been manufacturing advanced centrifuges for years, and much of that production has been completely outside of IAEA monitoring since they rolled back their JCPOA commitments. This means they've almost certainly been building up a significant reserve of uninstalled components, like a massive spare parts warehouse that could be quickly deployed for rapid rebuilding somewhere else, maybe in new unknown locations.
So the capability doesn't just vanish with the buildings.
Precisely. Their long-term capacity is sustained by what analysts call a broad and distributed infrastructure, a deep bench of technically trained personnel, extensive domestic supply chains, and most critically, a resilient political will. You can bomb buildings, but you simply can't bomb knowledge or expertise or a nation's determination. It's like trying to destroy an idea with a hammer. It just doesn't work that way.
Okay, let's talk specifics then. What about the bottlenecks created by the strikes, and how might Iran try to work around them? Natanz, for example. You mentioned thousands of centrifuges likely knocked out.
Right. At Natanz, estimates suggest maybe 15,000 centrifuges are likely inoperable, mainly due to the power loss and structural damage underground. For them to rebuild that specific capacity at Natanz, it would probably require entirely new facilities, not just simple repairs. That does sound like a significant multi-year hurdle to overcome at that location.
But what about Esfahan, the conversion facility?
That's a bit different. At Esfahan, while the damage to the uranium conversion facilities, especially the UCF, is significant, the underlying chemical processes involved are actually relatively simple chemical operations compared to enrichment. This means, in principle, they could potentially rebuild that capability in parallel with any enrichment efforts elsewhere. So while it's a bottleneck right now, it might not cause as long-term a delay as the damage to the complex enrichment cascades at Natanz. It just highlights the resilience and adaptability of a program that's been running for decades.
Now let's pivot to Iran's reaction to all of this. Because instead of seeing some kind of strategic retreat or maybe quiet rebuilding, what we've seen publicly is this unwavering defiance, almost a doubling down, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It started right at the top.
Yeah.
Supreme Leader Khamenei himself publicly stated that the attacks did nothing significant to Iran's nuclear facilities, which seems hard to believe given the evidence, but that was the message. And he explicitly said that Iran is going to continue its nuclear program. Talk about a mic drop moment in terms of defiance.
And others followed suit.
Oh, yes. Mohammad Islami, who heads Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, he stepped up and said that preparations for recovery had already been anticipated, and our plan is to prevent any interruption in production or services. That's a clear signal. They weren't entirely caught off guard, and they had contingency plans ready to go, a kind of business-as-usual posture despite the massive strikes.
And Ali Shamkhani, the former security chief.
He echoed this too. He said, Iran's enriched material, indigenous knowledge, and political will remain untouched. And he boldly claimed, quote, "The game is not over." It's a powerful statement of continued resolve. Even the Iranian ambassador over in Geneva declared that Iran will resolutely defend its inherent right to defend itself against any aggression and never give up its inalienable right to the peaceful use of nuclear knowledge and energy. They're sticking to their guns, rhetorically at least.
Does this mean the conflict just goes underground now? More shadow warfare?
That seems highly likely. There's widespread skepticism that this ceasefire, announced on June 23rd, will truly hold in the long run. We're probably going to see continuation of what's called hybrid warfare. That includes things like assassinations, sabotage attacks, cyber attacks. It's a way to continue the conflict through other means. a low-intensity, but still very high-stakes shadow war.
And here's a really strange twist in their response. Iran is actually turning around and blaming the IAEA, the international watchdog.
Yes, that was quite remarkable. They've publicly accused the IAEA of complaining and nagging, demanding more than necessary. And there seems to be a genuine belief, or at least a propagated belief, within Iran that the IAEA's information sharing somehow enabled these targeted strikes. The public sentiment and officials' reports say all blame IAEA chief especially and the IAEA lack of cooperation with Iran working in the hands of the United States.
So they're painting the watchdog as an enemy collaborator.
Essentially, yes, and it escalated to direct threats. Iranian officials warn that if the IAEA didn't condemn the U.S. and Israeli attacks sufficiently, the agency would face direct consequences from our decisions. This is a really significant shift in their narrative. They're trying to paint the IAEA not as a neutral observer, but as an accomplice. And that could have incredibly serious implications for any future monitoring or transparency. It's like blaming the referee for a bad call after you committed the foul.
And perhaps the most unsettling response isn't just the official defiance, but what seems to be happening inside Iran, this shift in public opinion.
That is arguably the most profound and potentially dangerous consequence. Reports, apparently based on recent polling, suggest there are now increasing voices in Tehran from among the public demanding that Iran build a nuclear bomb. Not just the capability, but an actual weapon.
And this is framed as being for security.
Exactly. The demand is increasingly framed as being for security and protection, even despite that long-standing religious fatwa from the supreme leader against nuclear weapons. There's a strong sense emerging from analysis that these attacks have fundamentally changed Iran's nuclear path and orientation. That's a potentially seismic shift in their internal discourse, pushing them much closer to a decision point they've perhaps avoided for decades.
This internal shift feels really significant. You mentioned the historical context is Iran pursuing this capability since before the '79 revolution, linking it to national pride, resistance.
Right. It's deeply ingrained. And the current clerical regime under Supreme Leader Khamenei, they have this long, well-documented history of pushing back against challenges rather than pragmatically dealing with them. Often, external pressure is interpreted almost as validation for their stance, reinforcing their resolve.
So while the aspiration for nuclear capability isn't new, these attacks seem to have fundamentally changed the internal debate about how to achieve it and maybe how far they should go. You mentioned the threshold strategy.
Exactly. Before these strikes, Iran was largely seen as pursuing that threshold strategy, maintaining all the pieces, all the capability to quickly assemble a weapon if they decided to, but stopping just short of actually possessing one. They were standing on the doorstep, ready to sprint inside, but they hadn't actually crossed the threshold into the house, so to speak.
But now that strategy is being questioned internally.
It seems so.
Yeah.
In the stark aftermath of these strikes, reports suggest Iranian elites are increasingly seeing Tehran's threshold strategy as a miscalculation. Why? Because it clearly didn't provide sufficient deterrence to prevent these massive attacks.
Well, the thinking is maybe being almost nuclear isn't good enough.
That appears to be the emerging logic. This is leading to growing internal pressure to consider the development of an actual deterrent, meaning acquiring and possessing a weapon. The idea of having the bomb, rather than just the capability to build one quickly, seems to be gaining traction within their decision-making circles. The strikes might have inadvertently pushed them towards the bomb, not away from it.
And how are others reacting to this potential shift? What are international figures saying?
Well, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio highlighted the dilemma. He basically said, look, if Iran genuinely just wants a civilian program, it can simply import the enriched fuel it needs, like most countries do. If it insists on enriching uranium itself, especially at high levels, he argued, it would be the only country in the world that doesn't have a weapons program, quote unquote, but is enriching, which he bluntly called problematic. It raises immediate suspicions about intent.
And Trump's view, still hardline.
Very much so. Former President Trump declared, in all caps apparently, Iran will never rebuild their nuclear facilities, and added, I don't see them getting back involved in the nuclear business anymore. He even suggested further strikes if Iran dared to resume enrichment activities. So, a very different perspective there, assuming the problem is solved.
What about the fatwa? That religious decree against nukes, has it just become irrelevant now?
That's the huge question. The fatwa, the religious ruling by Khamenei against nuclear weapons, has always been cited, both by Iran and observers, as a major moral and political obstacle to them actually building a bomb. But this increasing domestic pressure, now apparently coming directly from segments of the public demanding a weapon for security. It raises a critical question. Could this religious barrier be challenged, reinterpreted, or somehow bypassed internally? It would be a significant ideological shift, but in times of perceived existential threat, such reinterpretations are not unheard of throughout history. It's a real moral and strategic tightrope for the regime.
This all leads us to an incredibly high-stakes question, one that could genuinely reshape global security.
Hmm.
Will Iran actually walk away from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT? For anyone listening who might not be familiar, maybe just quickly remind us what the NPT is and why leaving it would be such a big deal.
Sure. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, it came into force way back in 1970. It's arguably the cornerstone of the global arms control regime, maybe the most widely adhered to arms control agreement ever. As of 2025, 191 states are parties to it.
And main goals.
It's really threefold. First, stop the spread of nuclear weapons beyond the 5 states that had them in 1970, US, UK, France, China, Russia. Second, promote the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And third, encourage eventual nuclear disarmament by those original nuclear weapon states.
And the basic deal.
Simple. The 5 nuclear states agree not to transfer weapons or help non-nuclear states get them, and the non-nuclear states agree not to acquire or develop nuclear weapons themselves. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA we keep mentioning, is tasked with overseeing nuclear material and technology to make sure everyone's playing by the rules.
So what would be the immediate practical consequences if Iran just said, we're out?
If Iran formally withdraws, which requires 3 months' notice, by the way, it would immediately, legally, no longer be bound by the NPT's core prohibition on building a nuclear weapon. Perhaps more importantly, in the short term, Iran would then be completely free to engage in any nuclear activities it wants, without any IAEA monitoring or oversight. It's almost universally assumed they would immediately kick out the inspectors.
Plunging their program into darkness.
Exactly, a total black box. It's worth noting, of course, that 4 nuclear-armed states, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, are not members of the NPT, though Israel famously doesn't publicly acknowledge its program.
So how likely is an Iranian withdrawal? Is it just a bluff, something they've threatened before to gain leverage in negotiations? Or is this time really different because of the strikes?
That's the critical question. Iran has, in fact, threatened to withdraw from the NPT for several years, often using it as a potent bargaining chip in diplomacy. Give us sanctions relief, or maybe we'll leave the NPT. However, given the sheer enormity of the situation now, post-strikes, many analysts suggest Iran may genuinely feel compelled to respond very visibly in some big fashion. With many of their known facilities damaged, withdrawing from the NPT might be one of the few cards they can actually play on the diplomatic stage now to demonstrate ultimate resolve and defiance. It feels less like a bluff and more like a real, albeit drastic, option on the table.
And they've already taken steps that look like disengagement, haven't they? That law passed by their parliament.
Yes, that was a huge step. On June 25, 2025, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, overwhelmingly passed a law suspending cooperation with the IAEA. That's a very bold move, stopping just short of full withdrawal but making routine monitoring impossible.
What does that law actually do?
Under this new law, any future access for IAEA inspectors is now explicitly conditioned on approval by Iran's powerful Supreme National Security Council. No more routine access. And there are penalties for any unauthorized inspections. The justification: Iran squarely blamed IAEA information sharing for enabling the U.S. and Israeli strikes, essentially painting the IAEA as complicit.
So the watchdog is now the scapegoat.
Pretty much. And the consequence, as analysts see it, is that this collapse of IAEA monitoring represents perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the U.S. and Israeli operations. Why? Because it gives Iran operational space to pursue covert reconstitution efforts and removes all crucial oversight. It creates this dangerous information vacuum right when the world needs maximum transparency.
What about Russia in all this? They're a major nuclear power, an NPT signatory. Would they actually help Iran build weapons if Iran left the treaty?
That seems highly unlikely. Russia, as an NPT signatory itself, directly helping Iran build nuclear weapons would be seen as, well, beyond the pale internationally. It would severely damage Moscow's own non-proliferation credentials, which they still value to some extent. Instead, Iran would more likely seek Russia's diplomatic assistance.
How so?
To use their veto power, perhaps, to block any moves by the UN Security Council to impose any penalties on Iran for leaving the NPT or resuming suspicious activities, and also to publicly castigate the United States on the world stage for the initial attacks. It's about political cover and diplomatic leverage, not really about getting direct bomb-making help from Moscow.
And just quickly, what damage does this whole situation do to the NPT itself? You have the U.S., a founder and key pillar of the treaty, attacking a fellow member's nuclear facilities. That seems problematic for the treaty's health.
It's definitely awkward, to say the least. While the U.S. attacking another NPT signatory's nuclear facilities doesn't technically violate the letter of the treaty itself from a strict legal standpoint, the treaty prohibits proliferation, not military strikes per se. It certainly raises profound questions about its spirit and its long-term viability. However, it's also true that many of America's friends and allies might view it pragmatically as legitimate geostrategic move aimed at dismantling what they saw as Iran's dangerous nuclear hedging strategy, that ability to quickly build a weapon. It really highlights the complex, often messy tension between international legal norms and raw geopolitical power plays.
Okay, let's imagine the worst-case NPT scenario happens. Iran does walk away and maybe signals it's pursuing weapons. What's the regional fallout? You mentioned this could trigger a serious ripple effect, like a line of dominoes falling across the Middle East.
Absolutely. This is one of the most destabilizing potential outcomes, the one that keeps analysts up at night. The potential for a regional proliferation cascade is a massive concern. Saudi Arabia, for instance, has publicly and repeatedly vowed to match Iran if Iran were ever to acquire nuclear weapons.
So Iran leaving the NPT would be the trigger for Riyadh.
It would almost certainly be seen by Saudi Arabia as the clearest possible signal that Iran is actively pursuing weapons, regardless of Iranian denials. That perception alone could lead Saudi Arabia to seriously consider withdrawing from the NPT itself and activating its own, albeit less advanced, nuclear options or seeking weapons from elsewhere.
And it might not stop with Saudi Arabia. What about Egypt?
Egypt is another key player to watch. They have long expressed deep frustration, a real grievance that Israel possesses nuclear weapons outside the NPT and faces no international monitoring or pressure. They see it as a profound unfairness, a regional double standard.
So if Iran and maybe Saudi Arabia leave the NPT.
Exactly. If other major regional players start withdrawing, Egypt might think it would be worth their while to pull out as well. Why should they be bound by rules others are flouting, especially when their perceived rival, Israel, isn't bound at all? This could quickly lead to a broader unraveling, not just in the Middle East. You could see other countries around the world similarly fed up with the international nuclear order, also considering withdrawal. It risks widespread regional and potentially even global proliferation. It's the nightmare domino scenario.
So Iran's nuclear program, it isn't just about the centrifuges and the enriched uranium, is it? There's this massive, often overlooked parallel threat that rides alongside it, their huge missile arsenal. And this was a major blind spot in past deals, wasn't it? Like the 2015 JCPOA.
A huge blind spot. It was often called the missile-size loophole. The JCPOA, incredibly, when you look back, imposed no direct verifiable limits on Iran's ballistic or cruise missiles. None.
Oh. Nothing at all.
Pretty much nothing binding. UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which endorsed the JCPOA in 2015, only vaguely called upon Iran not to undertake activities related to ballistic missiles designed to be capable of delivering nuclear weapons. The language was incredibly ambiguous, non-binding, and full of loopholes. And even those weak voluntary limitations officially expired in October 2023.
So effectively, no international checks on their missile program for years now.
Correct. That omission, while maybe politically necessary to get the JCPOA done at the time, left this monumental gap in non-proliferation efforts. And Iran has driven a truck through that gap.
How so? What have they been doing with their missiles since 2015?
They've massively accelerated its missile program and stockpiling efforts at an alarming rate. We're now talking about what's widely believed to be the Middle East's largest ballistic missile arsenal, over 3,000, according to U.S. estimates. That number alone is staggering, but it's not just quantity, it's quality too.
They're getting better, more accurate.
Dramatically better. Improved range, improved accuracy, improved survivability, and crucially, many of these missiles are now considered capable of carrying custom-designed nuclear warheads with relatively straightforward modifications. They've also significantly enhanced the survivability of their missile force by building numerous hardened underground bases. Think massive subterranean bunkers carved into mountains.
How many of those bases are there?
Estimates vary widely, maybe 25 to 50 that we know of, though Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, claims they have as many as 100. Point is, they're dispersing and protecting their arsenal. Their medium-range systems can already easily reach targets like Israel, all of the Arabian Peninsula, even parts of southeastern Europe, and their shorter-range missiles blanket the Persian Gulf and all the U.S. bases in the region.
And the technology is advancing rapidly, too.
very rapidly. They've made big strides in solid propellant technology, which means missiles can be launched much more quickly, with less warning time. They're also developing missiles that are much harder for defenses like Patriot or Iron Dome to intercept. We're talking about potentially hypersonic velocities, warheads that can maneuver in flight, decoys to confuse radars, other penetration aids, and even their civilian satellite launches using large rockets demonstrate a growing potential for developing intermediate range and maybe eventually even intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. It's a very sophisticated, rapidly evolving capability that adds a whole other layer of threat alongside their nuclear ambitions.
And they're developing cruise missiles, too. Those are harder to track, right?
Yes, cruise missiles are now a key and increasingly potent part of their arsenal. Since 2015, they've unveiled at least 6 new long-range types, with ranges stretching from 700 up to 1,650 kilometers. Because they fly low, hugging the terrain, they are inherently harder to detect and intercept than ballistic missiles, which follow a high, predictable arc.
Any new developments there?
Just last year, in 2023, they claimed to have introduced a boosted hypersonic cruise missile, the Fatah-2, with a claimed range of 1,500 kilometers. If true, that provides a highly survivable precision strike capability that can threaten targets far beyond their immediate neighborhood. This isn't just about deterrence anymore. It's about power projection.
And crucially, Iran isn't just building these missiles for parades or to sit in silos. They're actually using them, aren't they?
They absolutely are. This is not theoretical. Since 2017, Iran has directly launched hundreds of ballistic and cruise missiles in at least 9 major distinct operations. They've targeted adversaries and groups in Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, even hitting Israel directly earlier this year, and Saudi Arabia in the past. These strikes serve, as analysts say, dual purposes. They're partly about retribution for perceived attacks or slights, but they're also very much about strategic signaling, demonstrating their capabilities and their willingness to use them.
And they're spreading the technology around, too, to proxies.
Yes, and this proliferation is incredibly well documented and deeply worrying. We've seen extensive transfers of missiles and, perhaps even more ubiquitously, drones to Russia for use in Ukraine and to their network of regional proxies.
Yeah.
Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various militias in Iraq and Syria.
Why did they do that?
This strategy allows Iran to entrench its regional influence, to project power indirectly, and to impose costs on its adversaries like the U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, without risking direct confrontation that could lead to devastating retaliation against Iran itself. And crucially, they're not just exporting the finished weapons, they're also exporting the precision guidance technologies, allowing their proxies to build and upgrade their own arsenals. It's like a deadly franchise model, and these active uses by proxies also serve as real-world testing and refinement for Iranian capabilities.
Okay, so knowing all of this about the scale, the sophistication, the actual use, and the proliferation of Iran's missiles, it seems absolutely undeniable that any future agreement, any attempt at diplomacy, simply has to include limits on these missiles, right? Ignoring it seems insane.
I think that's the overwhelming consensus now among security experts and policymakers, yes. Missile restrictions are seen as essential in any future agreement. The thinking is that ignoring them again, like the JCPOA largely did, would simply kick the can down the road and lead to even more formidable national security difficulties later on. It's basically a non-starter to have a nuclear deal without addressing the delivery systems.
So what kind of missile limits are being proposed? What could that look like?
Well, several measures are being discussed. A key one is to renew and significantly strengthen those lapsed UN restrictions from Resolution 2231. This would mean verifiably banning all testing, development, and technology transfers of missiles clearly capable of carrying nuclear warheads, both ballistic and long-range cruise missiles.
How do you define nuclear capable? That was part of the problem before, wasn't it?
It was. So experts suggest using the established international standard from the Missile Technology Control Regime, the MTCR, as a clear benchmark. The MTCR baseline defines nuclear-capable missiles as those with a range of 300 kilometers or more and a payload capacity of 500 kilograms or more. Using that as a technical benchmark and an intent-based boundary could provide clarity. Some even suggest the verification model used in the old 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF, treaty between the U.S. and the Soviet Union could offer useful lessons.
And how do you get Iran to agree to this? Link it to sanctions?
That seems like the most powerful lever, yes. Future sanctions relief should be explicitly and directly hinged on Iran, verifiably halting the development, testing, and transfer of all missiles and long-range drones that exceed that MTCR threshold. And not just halting, but allowing verifiable elimination of existing stocks above that limit. And you'd need a robust, probably UN-led, monitoring mechanism to oversee compliance.
What about getting regional players involved? Could that help?
That's another important proposal. Washington should actively encourage its regional partners, think specifically the Gulf Arab states and Israel, to initiate a direct regional missile dialogue with Tehran. This wouldn't be about total disarmament initially, but could include concrete confidence-building measures like pre-launch test notifications, limits on missile deployments near borders, and a verifiable halt on transfers to non-state actors like Hezbollah or the Houthis. Framing this as a regional security package rather than something imposed solely by the West might make it more palatable to Iranian leaders and increase the chances of success.
But Iran, of course, has its own powerful narrative about its missiles. They portray them as essential for defense, symbols of national pride, resistance.
Absolutely. Iran heavily promotes this narrative, portraying its missiles as symbols of legitimacy, strategic influence, resistance, and even divine justice, using that kind of language to shield the program from any external scrutiny or limitations. It's a huge part of their domestic propaganda and their projection of national identity.
Do people inside Iran buy that narrative?
It's hard to say definitively, but many analysts believe that many Iranians themselves understand that a lot of this is a function of the regime's ideological posturing and false narratives, used primarily to maintain control and rally support against external enemies. A truly balanced solution, proponents argue, would actually cap Iran's nuclear threat and genuinely constrain its long-range missile reach, while still allowing for shorter-range systems, those below the 300-kilometer MDCR threshold for legitimate defensive purposes. Ultimately, including verifiable missile limits, would be key to redefining regional stability and genuinely reassuring nervous allies in the region.
So we've looked at the strikes, the damage, the defiant response, the NPT risks, the missile threat. Where does this leave diplomacy? With all this destruction and defiance, all these shifting red lines, is diplomacy still even on the table, or is it just a pipe dream in this new, much more dangerous landscape?
That's the critical question hanging over everything right now.
Let's just quickly remember the troubled history of the last major diplomatic effort, the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. It was adopted with the goal of ensuring Iran's nuclear program was exclusively peaceful, offering significant sanctions relief in exchange for tight monitoring and restrictions.
But it faced huge challenges almost from the start, didn't it?
Yeah.
The U.S. famously withdrew under President Trump in 2018, reimposing harsh sanctions. Iran then responded by gradually rolling back its own commitments under the deal, restarting prohibited activities, enriching uranium to higher levels.
A slow-motion collapse.
Pretty much. Yet, surprisingly, even amidst all that, over the last few months leading up to these strikes, the remaining JCPOA participants, that's China, Russia, France, Germany, the UK, plus Iran, they actually increased efforts to try and find a way back to full implementation. And even Iran and the U.S. reportedly engaged in 5 rounds of quiet, indirect bilateral talks facilitated by Oman.
And what came of all those last-ditch efforts?
Regrettably, neither initiative produced a way forward. The disagreements, the lack of trust, it was just too deep. And now, obviously, these recent massive military strikes have only complicated the prospects for diplomacy even further.
But there was that ceasefire announcement. A glimmer of hope, maybe?
Yes, that was significant. The U.S., working closely with Qatar, managed to announce a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Iran on June 23, 2025, stopping the direct tit-for-tat attacks for the time being. The UN Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, she welcomed this immediately as a significant achievement that potentially pulls Iran, Israel, and the region back from the brink.
So the ceasefire is seen as breathing room.
Exactly. It's seen as a crucial, if potentially temporary, opportunity to avoid a catastrophic escalation and achieve a peaceful resolution. It's a fragile window, maybe, but it's a window nonetheless.
So some international actors, like the UN, are clearly still pushing hard for talks, despite everything.
Oh, absolutely. The UN and several key countries strongly believe that diplomacy, dialogue, and verification remain the best option to ensure the exclusively peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program, and to bring about concrete economic benefits to the people of Iran. All 5 remaining JCPOA participants, China, Russia, France, Germany, and the UK, they've actually reiterated their commitment to finding a diplomatic solution, even while acknowledging their own diverging outlooks on how to get there.
But what about the key players who carried out the strikes? What's the U.S. stance now, under Trump's potential influence or return?
Well, former President Trump's current stance seems far less enthusiastic about diplomacy, to put it mildly. He recently stated, regarding a potential new deal, "We may sign an agreement. I don't know. I don't think it's that necessary." He also added, regarding Iran's nuclear program, "I don't see them getting back involved in the nuclear business anymore. I think they've had it." This suggests a belief, or at least a public posture, that the military action has fundamentally solved the problem, making further diplomacy largely redundant in his view.
And complicating any diplomatic path is the IAEA's role, and Iran's escalating obstruction, right? That seems like a huge roadblock.
A massive roadblock. Remember, the IAEA's report back on May 31st, 2025, just before the strikes, specifically noted that the significantly increased production and accumulation of highly enriched uranium by the Islamic Republic of Iran was of serious concern. They were already sounding the alarm bells.
And the strikes have made monitoring even harder.
Much harder. The IAEA stated that their verification and monitoring activities have been seriously affected by Iran stopping implementation of its JCPOA commitments for over 4 years now. This has led to what they call a critical loss of continuity of knowledge. They've essentially been flying blind in many areas, admitting they've been unable to verify the total stockpile of enriched uranium in the country since way back in February 2021.
And now Iran is formally suspending cooperation.
Exactly. Despite the IAEA saying they're ready to resume inspections if allowed, Iran's parliament went ahead and approved that bill on June 25th, 2025, to formally suspend cooperation with the IAEA. This strongly suggests Tehran is simply not in the mood to entertain any UN oversight right now. It creates this dangerous information black hole, making any attempt at arms control verification, which is the bedrock of any nuclear deal, incredibly difficult, if not impossible, in the near term. How can you have a deal if you can't verify it?
So pulling all these threads together, what truly comes next in this incredibly high-stakes chess game? It feels like so much hinges on what actually happened at Fordo, doesn't it? We're calling it the Fordo dilemma.
That seems about right. Analysts are looking at essentially 3 possible futures, 3 broad scenarios for Iran's nuclear program going forward. And they really depend heavily on the true extent of the damage to that deeply buried Fordo plant, and crucially, on whether that stockpile of highly enriched uranium was actually relocated before the strikes.
Okay, let's break them down. What's scenario 1?
Scenario 1. Fordo and its highly enriched uranium, HEU, are diminished, damaged, but still usable. Maybe some cascades survived, maybe some HEU is still there or was safely moved. In this case, the assessment is that Iran is highly unlikely to just give up its nuclear program without facing further attacks. Why? Because of that historical commitment, that resistance to external pressure we talked about.
What would their thinking be in this scenario?
Iran's calculation might be, if parts of Fordo's cascade halls remain functional after taking hits from the most powerful conventional bunker busters, the regime could interpret this as proof that they can withstand the conventional might of the U.S. and Israel. This might actually embolden them to push even harder for that threshold capability, or maybe even make a calculated swift dash to a weapon.
What's the risk there?
The major risk is that any post-strike activity at Fordo, or attempts to restart enrichment elsewhere, would almost certainly be detected by intelligence agencies. This would likely lead to potentially inevitable future Israeli attacks, maybe even preemptive ones, perhaps with or without direct U.S. involvement this time. So this scenario really only suggests a temporary pause in the conflict, a fragile calm before the next storm inevitably breaks.
Okay, not exactly reassuring. What's scenario 2?
Scenario 2. Fordo is fully destroyed, truly knocked out, and critically, none of its valuable HEU stockpile survived the strikes or was moved to safety beforehand. This would be a monumental game changer, the outcome the strikes were presumably intended to achieve.
And the consequence?
Here, analysts believe Iran might actually be compelled to give up its nuclear program in negotiations. Why? Because they'd be facing the grim reality that it would take many, many years to restore their nuclear program if both Fordo and Nansen's, plus the key weaponization infrastructure, are truly and irrevocably damaged and they've lost their HEU stockpile.
So this is where diplomacy might actually work.
This is the scenario where diplomacy has the most leverage. Iran might be willing to trade away its nuclear ambitions, especially if offered significant incentives. Concrete guarantees on regime security, substantial and lasting sanctions relief, and perhaps legitimate access to civilian nuclear power technology under strict monitoring. But even here, substantial and highly intrusive IAEA monitoring would become absolutely necessary to ensure that, after the immediate heat is off, Tehran does not covertly resume its nuclear program down the line. They'd still retain the knowledge, the expertise for a faster rebuild later. The threat doesn't vanish entirely, but it's pushed much further into the future.
Right. And the final, most worrying possibility, scenario 3.
Scenario 3. Fordo remains largely functional, perhaps barely damaged, whether or not the HEU was relocated. This is considered the least likely scenario given the number of bunker busters used, but it carries the most severe potential consequences.
Why is this one so bad?
In this situation, the Iranian regime might become dangerously convinced that conventional weapons simply cannot damage the facility enough to endanger the country's nuclear enrichment program. They might see Fordo as effectively invulnerable, proof that their strategy of deep burial works.
And the consequences of that belief?
They would be dire. Iran would retain an uninterrupted capability to enrich highly enriched uranium, perhaps with impunity. Israel would almost certainly demand even more advanced bunker-busting munitions from the U.S. and would undoubtedly pursue further military action. Regional stability wouldn't improve. It would likely deteriorate dramatically. And it raises serious concerns about other, perhaps even deeper or unknown, protected facilities. Like that mysterious Pickaxe Mountain complex near Natanz, discovered in 2024, purpose unknown, uninspected multiple tunnel entrances.
Or they could restart work at older sites.
Exactly. Previously sanitized sites linked to the old Ahmad program, places like Levisan-Shian, Variman, Turkuzabad, which were not targeted in these recent strikes, could potentially be resurrected for covert activities.
And the ultimate risk of this darkest scenario, scenario 3.
The ultimate risk is that this scenario could lead Iran to definitively revive efforts to approach nuclear weapons capability, or even, in a desperate or emboldened move, decide to break out to a nuclear bomb and detonate it as the ultimate deterrent against future attacks. This would tragically result in the, quote, a very scenario that prompted Israel and the United States to target Fordo in the first place. It's the ultimate dangerous paradox. The military action, if it failed to significantly damage Fordo, could inadvertently accelerate the very nuclear proliferation threat it sought to neutralize.
So after diving deep into all these complexities, the conflicting assessments, the defiant responses, the NPT questions, the missile factor, these potential future scenarios, what does this all mean? The overarching question really seems to be, can the international community, through diplomacy or deterrence or some combination, actually manage Iran's incredibly resilient political will to sustain its nuclear trajectory, especially now that its own internal red lines regarding weaponization seem to be dissolving under pressure? Considering all these intricate moving parts, the fog of war, the unknowns, what do you, listening right now, think is the real long-term consequence of these strikes on Iran's ultimate nuclear ambitions? Has it set them back for years or inadvertently pushed them closer to the bomb? And maybe more importantly, is the world truly ready for whatever next strategic game Iran might choose to play? Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Our handle is 8digitalcodenos, and we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what you enjoyed about today's episode, what didn't quite land, and what stories you'd like us to dive into next. Until next time, thanks for listening and stay tuned.